Good morning. So this is what I'd like to cover today. It's usually a two-day course to actually summarize the basics of fatigue and fatigue management. So obviously I'm not going to be covering things in any great detail in just a very focused area of the talk. I wanted to point out the supplementary information and studies that I'll be including in the slide deck that you'll receive in the DVD at the end. I'll be referring to several studies that I won't have time to cover, but it will be in the slide deck for you to refer to afterwards. And the note on the cardinal rules I'll get to later. Otherwise, very straightforward presentation as I've outlined here. Here's your question to start with. You guys are all looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so you probably don't actually need to assimilate too much from the talk, but hopefully not too many of number 3 are going to be occurring in the next little while. Very good. Now, to get to the cardinal rule that I'm breaking in giving this presentation, if you can substitute co-pilot, you can substitute flight surgeon. This is a cardinal rule in the Canadian Forces, and I'm obviously going to be breaking both since I'm hoping to be involved in actually touching the way that the Royal Canadian Air Force actually functions, and obviously I'm not keeping my mouth shut either. As we heard previously this week, there are many high-profile incidents that actually have been contributed to by fatigue. There are some actual less dramatic examples that we have in Canada that I think actually highlight the concern. And that is that we actually have something called daylight saving time. I don't know whether that's something that's common in Europe or not. But essentially, every spring, we lose an hour of sleep in an effort to have more sunlight, essentially. And that happens on the weekend, on a Saturday night. And more than 24 hours later, on the following Monday, we get a 7% increase in motor vehicle accidents. And this is very consistent. And this very quickly goes back down to baseline, and then the following fall, when we actually get an extra night's sleep, then we get a 7% decrease, lower than the baseline, that eventually gradually goes back up to the baseline. So that indicates that it's a very consistent and very real effect. Also, the latter also indicates that we're actually always functioning at a level of fatigue that is dysfunctional in our society. Which I don't think is a surprise to too many of us who've been through residency. We do have one province that acts as a control for this. This is Saskatchewan. It does not have any time change. It's characterized as a rather rural province, perhaps somewhat unfairly. And so the common joke is that, of course, they don't do the time change to keep the cows happy. So in the Canadian Forces, so far, we have a very by-the-numbers, straightforward approach to fatigue management that I think is common to many air forces, and that is you work so many duty hours and then you have to have so many off. And within a 30-day period, you can only fly so many hours. So, for instance, within the Canadian Forces, for our transport pilots, if within 30 days you're only supposed to work 120 hours. Unfortunately, this often goes out the window when we're in an operational environment. In any case, not necessarily that effective. And what we've actually used is the fatigue assessment scheduling tool that's been mentioned earlier. This is actually something that was developed partially through one of our researchers at the Defense Research Development Corporation in Canada. It's a half Canadian Forces, half civilian Department of National Defense facility that is involved in a great deal of research, and in concert with the Canadian Space Agency and NASA, they've developed this tool and several others. And much of what I'll be talking about is by a researcher, Michelle Paul, who is actually quite active in this area. So, if I were to give an example of the fatigue avoidance or assessment scheduling tool in use here, you can see that there's a green band, and within the band, this is the level of, and the lines that you can see here are the levels of cognitive function. So if you're within the green, obviously you're doing well, and if you start being in the yellow, that's essentially how you've been after you've lost at least 24 hours of sleep. And as you progress to the bottom of the yellow, it's when you've lost a further 12 hours after that. So that's all very approximate. It's equivalent to those things. You don't necessarily have to have lost that sleep. You can lose it just simply through time zone changes and so forth. These lines here, the dotted and the solid line, are equivalent to the levels of blood alcohol, levels of impairment essentially, depending on which country you're in, 0.05 and 0.08% respectively. And I understand these are a little hard to read here, so each of these slots here is a day. So that was obviously a very good level of function. That was from one of our aircraft commanders that had been in theater for 1 month while in overseas operations. Unfortunately, we had to switch to nighttime operations due to the tactical situation. And you can see here the thick lines, obviously highlighted in red as well, highlight when the pilot was actually flying. So what's thick is when they were flying, and they're highlighted in red because they're obviously terrible. He is actually flying when he is at his lowest level of function and functionally impaired. The strength of this tool is that it can actually pick these things out. And what it's picking out, of course, are these effects of fatigue, which I think we're all familiar with, especially, again, having gone through residency, we've all experienced this. But in fact, this actually looks an awful lot like another condition that we run into frequently, certainly with aircrew, and with my background in the Navy, I certainly run into it as well, and that's this. And that's really what fatigue does. It is equivalent to alcohol intoxication, with perhaps the exception of the microsleeps, which occur differently with intoxication. So what we have is a very motivated group, aircrew, that are idealistic, want to push through, get the job done. And so of course they're saying, oh, I'm just a little tired, but I can work through it. And this is what we need to actually combat, because it's not safe. They certainly would not say, I hope, I'm just a little drunk, I can work through it. But now we realize, of course, this is the equivalent level of impairment that we're dealing with. And this is the change that we need to pass on to our aircrew and get them to bring aboard. So with the use of the FAST, we were able to intervene in the scheduling of our aircrew and our overseas operations, and it was actually quite successful. The Navy actually was quite intrigued by this because they had some operational problems in our submarine fleet. And so they asked us to perform a similar assessment, actually quite a bit more in depth, where we actually used actigraphs to determine how well people were sleeping and what kind of sleep they were getting, as well as assessing their overall operational environment. And we were able to actually intervene and make some recommendations, including changes in schedules. And the Navy was actually very impressed by this, which is quite impressive given the fact that it tends to be a somewhat, shall I say, hidebound or tradition-oriented service. And this is a comment that we received from the commander of the submarine forces. He was very impressed. It's the largest single increase in operational effectiveness that they've actually ever experienced. So this is a big pat on the back for us, and very encouraging in that we're actually able to affect operational effectiveness so well. So if you're actually dealing with countermeasures, which is after the fact, you already have fatigued people, what do you do about it? What we found worked very well in the submarine study was the use of caffeinated gum. And this is something that Canada has pioneered many years ago, where we actually contracted Wrigley's to produce 100 milligram caffeinated gum that the troops would actually take in theater, and during breaks in their patrol, when they were actually safe, they would actually take cognitive exams and see how well they were functioning. And they would also get some independent assessments on how they were actually functioning on the patrols themselves. And we found that this was in fact extremely effective. And quite surprisingly, even in moderately heavy coffee users, the caffeinated gum was still effective. So, an effective countermeasure that I would recommend to you, and that we would like to see used in the Royal Canadian Air Force as well. In the submarine environment, obviously, there's no windows and no screen doors. So, phototherapy is actually something that's very easy to implement because you have total control of your environment as far as the light goes. And this is something that we were able to maximize to our benefit, using phototherapy to actually suppress melatonin secretion, basically bright light therapy in high blue light wavelengths that actually suppress the release of melatonin from the pineal gland. And this is also an effective way. So essentially you have caffeine, you have phototherapy, and we actually have investigated the use of melatonin as well. And certainly there are other opportunities or other modalities that could be used, such as modafinil. However, in Canada, we face a mindset that is very much against the use of any drugs per se to enhance operations. And so this is something that is actually beyond us at the moment because of the cultural or political climate at the moment. So on the other side, dealing with insomnia, I think we're all familiar with this. This is done under very close medical supervision to avoid problems with the circadian rhythms, but it can certainly help to reset it and get people to actually catch up on their sleep. But this is the be-all and end-all. It is far easier to prevent something than it is to treat it afterwards. And the countermeasures are, by definition, treating it afterwards. That's secondary prevention. Whereas actually dealing with the watch schedule itself, dealing with the workload, the sleep patterns, that is primary prevention. It's the immunization, if you will. And this is what the Navy was able to actually introduce and essentially make it so they really didn't need to use any of the stimulants. Even though they were, as the Navy often is, quite interested in that sort of thing. So we had a similar situation develop later, yet again with the Air Force, where with operations in Libya, we had several incidents that actually worried our operators. And at the squadron level, in multiple squadrons, multiple airframes, we had incidents that were of concern. And so, again, we were asked to intervene and assess. And so the Defense Research Corporation in Toronto was involved in this, again, using the FAST primarily. And again, remember, this tool is a predictor, but we found that it's actually very, very effective, far more so than you would expect. The in-flight factors that you would think would confound the sleep effects actually were not such a big deal, because essentially the better rested you are, the better you're going to be able to deal with those confounding factors. So we found that it was an excellent predictor, and as you can see here, it's not just applicable to Aircrew, of course. So this is an example of an assessment that we did on our Polaris fleet, our Airbus fleet, and when the Aircrew saw this, they're absolutely ecstatic. As you can see right here, admin duties, poor function, admin duties, poor function, admin duties, poor function. So the Aircrew automatically came to the conclusion, aha, if we eliminate Aircrew having to do admin duties, we will solve our fatigue problem. And of course they were ecstatic about this. Unfortunately, it is more complicated than that. Boy, tough crowd. Most people laugh about that one. Okay, these are the three incidents that caused the intervention, and this is with our C-17 fleet. There was hot brakes due to a checklist oversight. That was on landing. We had one of our planes almost land at the wrong airfield. Fortunately, it's an almost. And we had overspeed flaps on landing. So these are relatively major items with big potential for problems. Fortunately, they did not happen, but they were a red flag. So what you actually see is a fast result done on their schedule after the fact. So what we did is we had the researchers back in Toronto actually downloaded the computerized scheduling of our crews, and they were blind to the incidents and the timings. So they essentially, blind to this, entered all the material into FAST and came up with this schedule. And not surprisingly, you can see that the mistakes did happen at areas of low function. So the thick parts of the line are when the crews are actually flying. And as you can see, all of the incidents happened at times when they were essentially relatively low function. Now, just note that the bottom part of this slide has been expanded and the yellow part has been shrunk because the levels are actually so low that, that we had to expand the bottom half to actually accommodate it. So that's how low the cognitive function actually became in this group. Now, this was not confined to our C-17 group. The Herc flight actually had similar problems, and this is actually, as you can see, quite a major one, having essentially potential for hypoxia on a relatively routine flight. Now, we were able to confirm actually that this was not secondary to the very good beer that is available in the United Kingdom in this particular case. So in fact, this truly was a circadian dysrhythmia that actually contributed to this. So the strength of the FAST is that you can actually take the schedule of members that are in the same crew and get different results. So this one here shows a somewhat linear decrease in overall effectiveness that you get with crews as they do multiple transatlantic flights, so multiple transmeridian flights. So this is exactly the same crew, different member, and you can see there's a significant difference in the level of function between the two members. And this is the strength of the FAST, is that you can actually find big differences in performance on the basis of what would not immediately be apparent, small changes in scheduling. So, not to belabor the obvious, but it's very clear from the modeling that was done that the FAST was able to actually predict when the air incidents would occur. And so it highlights that we need to emphasize to the aircrew, this is just like being just a little drunk. Essentially, this is a big deal. Now, multiple ways that we can actually treat fatigue, or deal with it, or manage it, I guess I should say. I'm not going to be covering all of them, but the ones that are highlighted here in larger font I want to mention briefly. But clearly for us, our challenge is the bottom thing, is actually changing the culture of the aircrew to actually accept that this is a big deal and to do something about it. Fortunately for us, it's the aircrew that actually came to us looking for help, and now all we have to do is convince the leadership. Usually it's the other way around. The leadership will introduce something and we have to convince the aircrew. So we're actually in a very good position in that regard. So perhaps for aircrew we should be using something like, I'm just a little bit hypoxic, but I can work through it, as a comparison instead of the alcohol. It would certainly have, I'm sure, be very effective for the American Raptor fleet, for instance. So what has the result of these interventions been? As a result of this assessment, we were able to get the operational leadership to come on board and actually use the FAST to optimize mission scheduling. And they are also interested in the other items that are mentioned here, and I'll just mention them briefly. So this would be an optimal schedule as confirmed by the FAST. Obviously you can't always be in the green, especially with multiple transmeridian flights. Here's an example of a itinerary that was developed by one Canadian Air Division, which is the operational headquarters for our Air Force. This came out of the Combined Air Operations Center, and essentially this is the one that tells the squadrons what they need to do. They essentially balance our resources. Because the squadrons are so impressed with the fatigue avoidance scheduling tool, they actually thought this is not very good. They were particularly worried about this and then the aftermath, because essentially, there's going to be another week after that where they're actually going to be starting out at this level. And they were very concerned about that. So they made a suggestion. They said, well, how about we do a different schedule? And as you can imagine, there was a very interesting reaction from the Air Operations Center that are not used to getting suggestions from the squadron. They're used to the squadron doing what they're told. And so we almost had to go down and treat some strokes down in the Air Operations Center. In any case, one compromise. And of course, they came back and said, no, absolutely not. And so what happened? Well, the squadron gave another compromise. And eventually, they were actually able to agree on a schedule that would actually work. And if you'll notice, between these, very small changes in timings of flights is really all it took. And it was essentially a 2-hour change in the initial flights at the beginning and just before the time shown in the fast schedule that actually gave us all these changes. So very small changes that did not affect operational effectiveness as far as the timings of the flights, but certainly did as far as flight safety, a big improvement in flight safety risk. So the last 3 items that I just wanted to mention: melatonin. As you can see here, this is the normal release of melatonin that you get from commercial formulations. However, there's one particular brand, and there's multiple ones that are available, but this is the one that we actually used in our studies. And you get very close to endogenous pattern of release. All right, it's a 3 milligram tablet, and we found it extremely effective. I think the reason that we're not actually seeing a lot of the results from this data is that the Cochrane database that was actually quoted earlier this week in answer to some questions that were raised is that a lot of this material is available in technical reports. So it actually is available to everybody in this room. These are technical reports from the Defense Research Corporation in Canada, but not actually included in the Cochrane review. So what we have actually encountered is very useful or very effective changes in circadian rhythm with the use of this form of the melatonin. For instance, we deal with sending our aircrew from southern bases to forward operating bases when we have alerts, and this can actually produce changes in essentially daylight timings that are as much as or more than what you would get with transmeridian flights. So essentially it's the polar time shift that we call it, and we've actually been able to very effectively use melatonin in these situations. So and one thing that we did find that may account for some of the negative side effects that were mentioned is that, in fact, if you're not careful about when you use it, you can actually make things worse with melatonin. And that's not surprising. It's an endogenous hormone, and if you take it at the wrong time, it's not surprising that it could actually affect things. And so when using this, in this case, it was under very tight control by the researchers, and what we propose is using this under very tight control by our flight surgeons when we use it with the Air Force in an operational setting. So for the bright lights, there's a lot of graphs that are actually involved in the studies to do with the bright lights, and I didn't want the graphs to be more interested in you than you are in them, so that's in the slide deck at the end. Essentially, there are some very effective ones and some that are less so, and some that are better tolerated than others. And you can see those in the slide deck at the end. The final thing that's rather interesting is the use of something called circadian eyeglasses. And these block out the blue light that actually suppresses the release of melatonin. And so, in fact, we could have Eastern traveling aircrew that would normally be flying into the sun actually wearing these glasses and not get their melatonin actually suppressed. So we would actually be able to keep them on their home schedule so that they could carry on and do night flying when they arrived, tactical operations at night without any change in their circadian rhythm, and therefore be at maximal effectiveness. And of course it allows us to manipulate their circadian rhythm in any other ways that might be required. So very, very effective. And so we proposed to the Air Force that they actually use the fast to conduct a risk assessment. And what we are trying to emphasize to them is, just because the fast tells you this is not a good way to do your mission doesn't mean you have to scrub the mission. You can just make small changes in the schedule. If you can't make small changes in the schedule, then you can mitigate your risk with something as simple as some use of caffeine. And that's our current challenge. My challenge is, this is where you guys are right now, the famous quote by Charles Lindbergh, losing resolution and control. So, as you can see here next to the outhouses that are being pushed over by this pilot, this is the list of studies that I've included in the slide deck at the end for those that are interested in the studies that I mentioned. And here's your question again.
Some of them up because there's more waiting at the time than before.
Right on. You're obviously mainly awake.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.